Hello and welcome to Lightways at Life Astrologer with me, Anna Isabel, and my guest today is Chris Mitchell. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Anna. Lovely to be here.
It's wonderful to be talking to you. And you have, I suppose, a very special mission because you're the first speaker from an event that's coming at the Astrological Lodge of London on the 7th of September for History Day. It's called Cosmic Shifts, and your talk is called A Shift in Time. So tell us about what this shift in time is.
Because I'm a traditional astrologer, I often end up looking at historic charts from centuries ago, and it can get really, really quite messy when you look at a chart to, in say William Lilly's Christian astrology. You go, well, none of these planets match up at all. What's going on here? Did he have a really bad ephemeris? And he didn't. He did have a calendar that doesn't quite correspond to ours, and so did a lot of medieval philosophers, and even 20th century philosophers in certain 20th century astrologers in certain countries. For example, Russia didn't, or the Soviet Union as it became, didn't adopt the Gregorian calendar until after the Russian Revolution. So when you look at very early charts and birth data and things, it can get very messy. And it's really annoying for us as astrologers because you go on to, you're giving a talk about some historic character and you look up their birthday and you get completely the wrong chart. And I wanted to explain why that's happening and give a talk about that, because really all calendars are astrological. They're all to do with a relationship with the sky. And a lot of us have forgotten that because we just take calendars for granted as something that's just there, that's useful, without realizing what that actually means.
Yes, and we have a difficult enough time with the changes in time from winter to summertime, and
Yes.
Which country started doing that when, and it's complicated enough just working that out, and thankfully computer programs have taken a great deal of the labor out of this, but I can remember having a book with the lists of what country started to change summertime to in accordance with when we were changing hours, etc. And particularly, I think Portugal was one of those tricky ones that you never knew where they stood. Was it continental time? Was it GMT time? One, the next year it was the other, and they couldn't make up their minds. So yeah, it's that's tricky enough. And now we're talking about an entire calendar shifting. But it wasn't the first time that the calendar shifted, was it?
No, the original shape, there's been lots and lots of calendars throughout history, but the one that most of us are familiar with was basically introduced by Julius Caesar in, I think, 46 BCE. And he had said, okay, the new year will begin on January the 1st. There'll be 365 days every year, and every 4 years we'll have a leap year. And we think that that's the calendar that we know and love now. In fact, it isn't. There was a slight change made so that every 100 years, even though it's divisible by 4, we don't have a leap year, but every 400 years we do. Most of us don't realize that because none of us were alive in 1900, and most of us aren't going to be alive in 2100, neither of which are leap years. And 2000 is divisible by 400, which means it was a leap year as usual. So that's quite complicated. Most of us have never noticed it because every 4 years it's a leap year, and has been all our life and will be for all our life. But there is this very subtle shift. And in the talk, I'm going to be explaining about why that shift needed to be made. And it was really for, even though we think it was religious reasons, it was actually astrological reasons.
Now that is interesting that it would be for astrological reasons. Here's something that I often come across, and it's the question of why it is that the year should begin in January rather than at the spring equinox.
It's a very good question. And when you look at the names of months, in English, and certainly in most Mediterranean languages, we have September, October, November, December, 7, 8, 9, and 10, which implies that the year started in March. And some of the Roman calendars did. So it was quite an interesting shift when Julius Caesar said, no, we're going to start with Janus, with January, named after the god Janus. Janus has two heads looking in both directions. So I think the idea is you can look backwards and you can look forwards when it's a new year. But another interesting thing that I will be covering in the talk is, in fact, we used to start the calendar on March the 25th, and that made it even more horrific. And when you look at some of Billy's charts, it looks as though the year's wrong. It isn't, but it looks as though the year's wrong. And there's a very odd reason for that. And it also has an impact on our tax returns in the UK, bizarrely enough. But I'm not going to give a spoiler away, that I will cover on the day.
Well, we certainly don't want any spoilers. So instead of the equinox, we shift to the beginning of the year in January, which makes absolutely no sense, because you're beginning at a time of year where everything is dead. It's not a time for beginnings. It has a 12th house feel about it in a sense, because well, in January, we're not even there yet. It's just this, we've just had the solstice. And he decides that it's for a Roman god because of a particular period. Was there any, so I guess the question I'm asking is there a link between that time of year and Janus, or was this an arbitrary decision?
I think it was an arbitrary decision. The calendar was a complete mess before he reformed it. And it does seem odd that he would have chosen January, because a lot of the Roman calendars used before, they did vary from region to region, were based around the equinox, and it would have made sense to make it the equinox or the solstice. But Roman months, the Roman calendar is really very confusing. Rather than having the first, second, third, fourth of the month, they had things like, well, you had the first, second, and third that were the calends, and then you had the ides in the middle. And then when you got to the end of the month, instead of saying, well, it's the 28th of September, it would be, well, it's the third day before October. So they kind of had, you know, positive and negative built into the calendar. So it was actually really quite difficult. It wasn't simply 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 up to, you know, 30 or 31 days. So it was a complicated system anyway. And even in medieval times, you still see them using that system. So you have the calends at the beginning of the month, and then the nones, which is up to 9 days before the end of the month, start being named after the month after it. So it was a pretty horrible system.
I'm just somewhere in the back of my mind, this is reminding me of something to do with ancient Egypt, but I can't quite grab it. I wonder whether you know what I'm thinking, because it seems to me that the Egyptian system was also quite complicated.
That's a very good question. I have to admit, I don't know anything about the Egyptian calendar, but of course, Egypt was under Roman rule by the time of Julius Caesar. So who knows? It's a very good point, though.
This is actually well before Roman times. And what I was wondering whether there was some sort of inheritance from Egypt coming into the Roman calendars. And it's not coming, but there's something there. But I remember thinking, oh my goodness, this is complicated. How did anybody ever know what? No, it's not coming. I almost had it there, almost had it, but it's so okay. So there's this complex system. So I guess the question that's coming to my mind is, how did they draw up charts using these irregular calendars with any degree of accuracy?
Well, we have fortunately, they would write in, certainly by medieval times, they would say, this happened on the feast day of so-and-so, and they would say, and the sun was at 18 degrees of Aries, and the elevation of the sun using an astrolabe. They would literally, get their instrument and lift up the arm and see where the sun is and go, and the sun was 26 degrees above the horizon, which gets over the problem. They didn't have accurate clocks, but the sun's pretty accurate. If you know the sun's 26 degrees above the horizon, we have a pretty accurate birth time as well as a pretty accurate birth date. So usually the charts are more reliable than written dates and clocks. If you see a chart, then use the chart and backfit it, because that definitely works better than trying to struggle with some of the dates and working out which system they're using. But of course,
Yes.
when it comes to calendars, the Roman calendar, which is effectively the one we still use, is solar. If you tell me that you were born on the 15th of August, and I don't know how old you are, I still know that you were born in the summer, and I still know that you're a Leo. But other cultures use different calendars. The Islamic calendar is strictly lunar. And that means that if you tell me you were born on the 15th day of Ramadan, I have no idea what season you were born in, but I do know that it was a full moon when you were born, because theirs is a lunar calendar. And because they don't care about years, it's purely 12 lunar months. It means that the year slips, the Islamic calendar slips by 11 days a year, which is why, Ramadan will shift all the time. And so in 2000, it was in the winter, and this year it was in the spring, and so on. So it also means that, I'm 62 using our calendar, but I think I'm 64 in Islamic years. So they have a different calendar. And the Jews have a different calendar again that they adopted from the Babylonians, which is a mixture of solar and lunar. So the months are lunar, just like the Muslim calendar. But then to make sure that the seasons don't keep shifting, they add in an extra leap month every 2 or 3 years.
There was something like that going on in the Egyptian calendars. And I do remember that there was a mix of sun, and that they had a civil calendar and that they had a religious calendar.
Right.
And that the two could be very distinctly different. And that the lunar calendar was much more in tune with the seasons, etc., because of the festivals that were being celebrated. And that was the religious calendar. So there was something going on that was similar to that. So it's very interesting, isn't it? And it makes me very grateful for the regularity that we have somewhat imposed on ourselves, because it does feel somewhat chaotic. I guess it doesn't really matter from the point of view that if you look at the sky, the planets are going to be where they're going to be, irrespective of what day we say it is. So that's fine. But why I asked the question was because if you were going to an astrologer and you were not local to that area, to that calendar, you would not be able to give your birth date and perhaps be immediately understood very easily. But of course, at that time, they would have been using horary charts, wouldn't they, a lot of the time?
Yes, a lot of people wouldn't have known their birth dates, but when you look at some of the ancient Greek texts, they have loads and loads of tables to convert between various sorts of years and various sorts of dates. So when you look at some of the Hellenistic examples, they will say, well, this chart was drawn up and this date corresponds to this in our calendar. So they did have to do all these complicated adjustments. And did they get them right? I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, you're talking about time zones. I remember driving through Vancouver a few years ago, and British Columbia, parts of it are on daylight saving times and parts of it aren't. And we'd drive through a small town and there would be a sign saying daylight saving time isn't in operation in this neighborhood. And then you drive another few kilometers and you'd be, it was daylight saving time. And it was a nightmare. I mean, when I was learning astrology, my astrology teacher was Dutch, and she was born during the war. And it was only while she was teaching this course, she realized she'd been using the wrong birth chart most of her astrological life, because they had double summertime in the Netherlands, and she didn't realize that. So she'd just been using single summertime, and said, oh, that changes my entire chart. So even today we have these problems. Yes,
and I believe that double summertime was in operation in this country as well.
Yes, but not all through the war. So you have to be really careful about the date shifts to get it to work. I mean, the interesting thing about the solar lunar calendar it's the best of both worlds, really. As I said, if you said you were born on the 15th of August, then I know you were born in the summer. If you said you were born on the 15th of Ramadan, I know that you were born when it's a full moon. But if somebody is using the Jewish calendar and says they were born on the 15th of Nisan, I know that not only is it a full moon, but it's a full moon in spring, because the seasons are right as well. And that is where the religious element comes in, because if I said I was thinking of going away for Christmas in 2026, and I asked you what date is Christmas Day in 2026, well, that's easy. It's the 25th of December. But I bet if I said to you, I want to go away for Easter in 2026, when's Easter in 2026? None of us can work that out on the top of our head, because it's actually a Jewish festival, or it's based on a Jewish festival, which means we have to suddenly shift from a solar calendar to a solar lunar calendar. And most of us can't do that because we don't tend to think in solar lunar terms. But from a Christian point of view, it's vitally important, because the Gospels say Christ was crucified on the eve of Passover. So you need to be able to calculate Passover to calculate Easter. And this caused absolute chaos in the minds of early Christians trying to get the formula right. And that was really kick-started maths, astronomy, and all sorts of things. It's why the church couldn't completely condemn astrology, because they actually needed these calculations to work out their most important festival.
Well, there's an interesting use for astrology.
Absolutely, yes.
So I'm just thinking about currently. So we've got the Gregorian calendar, which you're going to be talking about at the History Day at the Lodge. Are there any parts of the world that are not using the Gregorian calendar? And I'm thinking particularly because the Orthodox, Christian Orthodox, or I should say Orthodox Christians, have Easter and Christmas on different dates. So are they, in effect, using two different calendars? One would be ours for convenience, and then they have one of their own.
Indeed, the Russian Orthodox Church never adopted the Gregorian calendar. So you will hear midnight mass sometime in January every year, and they broadcast it every year. And it's not because it's Epiphany or anything like that. It is because it is the 25th of December in the Russian Orthodox calendar. So they've never adopted it. And of course, there's lots of countries that have both a religious calendar and a solar one, because the Gregorian calendar is pretty much used worldwide now. I think Saudi Arabia was the last country to adopt it officially in 2019, I think, very, very recently. But of course, they will also have used the Muslim calendar. So if you buy an Arabic newspaper, it will have the Muslim date and the international date. And the same with Jewish newspapers will have the Jewish calendar date and what we would think of as the international date.
From a practical point of view, what are the advantages of having a lunar calendar?
A strictly lunar one, it's hard to say, other than that you always know what the moon phase is, and it puts us in touch with the moon, which is nice. But it would be nice, I think having the best of both worlds, like having a Babylonian calendar or a Jewish calendar, tells you what moon phase it is and what season it is. And I think that's, those two bits of information are quite interesting, because for tens of thousands of years, we humans have been looking at the sun and the moon. They're the two most obvious bodies to look at. And we have always been aware of lunar phases, I think, and we've certainly been aware of seasons, certainly in the northern hemisphere, these latitudes, when it's cold in the winter and it's warmer in the summer. So I think a calendar that incorporates sun and moon really is the best of both worlds.
Well, of course, many calendars do have the phases of the moon on them as well, so we can be well
absolutely.
in that respect. If we're thinking about the Gregorian calendar, then, in terms of most of the West, at what point did it become more universally used? So is there a point at which the transition phase ended?
I suppose you could say 1921, which I think might have been when Greece adopted it. But by and large, Pope Gregory introduced it in the 1580s, I think, and Catholic countries in Europe tended to adopt it, but countries that either weren't Catholic or weren't too keen on the Pope for various political reasons didn't. And, you know, Britain's always been a little bit awkward when it comes to mainland Europe, as we saw with things like Brexit and so on. So I'm afraid we had Eurosceptics even back in the 1500s, which is why they weren't going to have anything to do with this European nonsense. So we struggled on with a calendar that just didn't work properly until 1752, when even we had to accept, actually, they did get it right after all, didn't they? And we are going to have to follow suit. So it's, I think part of it, of course, was the invention of the printing press. They knew that there were problems with the calendar in the 12th century, but having to write everything out by hand and distribute that to every church in Christendom would have just been impossible. By the time you get to the late 1500s, you've got a printing press, and then you can say, these are the new dates, this is how it works, and you can distribute it to all the churches. Because what you don't want to do is find different churches are celebrating Easter on different days. That would be a bit embarrassing.
That's really interesting. I hadn't considered that, but you do, of course, need certain things in place in order to make things a bit more accessible universally. And the would, of course, be that. So up until that time, people would have been relying on tradition.
Yes. Yeah, and sometimes getting it wrong. I mean, in medieval times, there were some people were celebrating Easter at different times because they got the formula wrong. And even in Judaism, there was an argument between two rabbis about the correct date of Passover in the 1100s, I think, and they ended up celebrating it a month apart. So,
yes, it's wonderful to discover the variety of things over which we could argue.
Absolutely, yes.
So so I guess the question I'm asking is, are there any sort of famous glaring errors that were made as a result of this confusion?
That's a very good question. I would say not famous ones, but you certainly notice when you look at Lily's charts, sometimes he uses one system and sometimes he uses another, because I think he had European clients. So sometimes his charts would be for somebody that was in the Netherlands who were using it, and sometimes they'd be for people in Britain who weren't using it. So you'll look at a date and go, well, hang on a minute, that one says 1st of March and it's a different year to this chart that says 1st of March, but it's another, you know, it's the next year, and yet they're both the same chart, or very similar charts in terms of planetary positions. And it's like, yeah, well, some of my clients are using one calendar and some were using another. And I think he's still got the charts right, but it looks ever so confusing when you look at the dates and try and work it out.
My estimation of William Lilly has gone up yet further. Navigating this confused system. So for people who are wanting to look at William Lilly and his charts, or even say Nicholas Culpeper, if we're looking at their charts, I presume that our computer programs, correct all of this?
Pretty much. In things like SolarFire, and I'm sure other computer systems are the same, you can say this is an old style date. SolarFire says if it's after a particular date, I'm going to assume it's new style, but you can say, no, this is old style because I'm looking at an English chart and not a Spanish one, for example.
So we still have to be aware. Yes. When we're given the date. Okay.
And this is a good time to put in a plug for Astro Data Bank, which is now free. The research that goes into that is absolutely amazing. Alois Steindl from Astrodienst is absolutely obsessive about accuracy and data quality. So when you look at Astro Data Bank, if you are writing about a historic character, check it on there. It will usually give you the new style date and the old style date and the chart. So you can be sure that you've got the right chart, and how you express the date is then up to you.
Yes, I love the Astro Data Bank. It's, yes. Well, Chris, you certainly have got me thinking and piqued my interest. And so for those who want to learn more, the title of the talk is A Shift in Time. It's part of the History Day Cosmic Shifts for the Astrological Lodge of London on the 17th of September, beginning at 10 o'clock and ending at 4:30, although that's not all, Chris. There are different speakers, some of whom will be cropping up on Lightways over the coming weeks. So if you are interested, I will be putting a link to the Astrology Lodge's website on the description box. Chris, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Anna. It's been lovely. Thank you.
And thank you all for watching. If you'd like to learn more about astrology, do check out my website. I have some really exciting courses coming up in September. One is for those of you who know a little bit about astrology but could use a refresher, or know a lot and could use a refresher. And the other is for those who are interested in planetary cycles and how to make best use of their energy. And I'll be looking at planets from Jupiter onwards. Next time, we're going to be looking at sun cycles. Until then, goodbye.